Alaba on Nawahi. But I work Makaya here at HCC. And so I'm just sitting here so we can learn more about the Hona of these places. Good friend Ron, excited to hear his awesome work.
That sounds
Hi, my name is Corey Asano. Aloha Aina.
yeah, is that
Today, Maile, Alii. One of the reasons why I'm here is I'm a parent, and I grew up lost, so that's not going to happen again. I'm going to learn the history, and I'm going to learn the stories. So, like, Blaze Vision, back along way with Ron and Lynette, part of the varsity team. Just white future. Nawahi is a hero.
Cat Brady, community justice advocate. I'm here today.
Use your big voice.
I'm here today because justice starts with the truth, and we need to get to the truth. So thank you, Ron. Happy birthday.
Yes. Henry Curtis, Hui Aloha Aina, Maile Alii, a historian buff, and I'm into energy resources and how we create the economic basis for the nation.
I'm Leilani Lindsay, California member also of the Aloha Aina. I come from Hilo. This morning we went to Pomelani Cemetery to place May on Josefa Nawahi's birthday. We didn't know that there was a ballistic missile warning going on. It was a beautiful, peaceful morning as we whispered morning to him. We had no idea what was going on. But he's beloved to us, and I continue to learn more and more about it. So I'm bringing that.
I'm Karen. I'm a former social studies teacher, always interested in history, always interested in learning more about this place that I live in.
Actually, I wanted to hear about what's going on. After all,
I'm Lani and here's my daddy.
I'm here Austin. I'm a psychologist, and there are a lot of connections in Connecticut and Hawaii, and I am here to learn more about them and understand my ancestors and how they interacted with Hawaiians.
Thanks for coming.
And I'm here to learn and to pass on the knowledge to my children.
I'm Sima Wilson. I'm mainly just Dr. Williams' assistant, but also fascinated and moved by what I'm learning about Hawaiian history and excited to learn more.
I'm Patrice Petridge. I moved here about 3.5 years ago, and without knowing the culture and the history of where you live, you are not a true participant. So I thank all of you for teaching me.
Emily Kantakawa, Aloha Aina, and here to keep learning because history is important and our liberation is through learning history.
Ayo.
Aloha, Midge Wright, born and raised in South Korea. Didn't learn the history, elementary, intermediate, high school, and I love history now.
Aloha, I'm Stephen Robello. I'm with Hui Aloha Aina, Honolulu, and Kale Maile Alii. Always wondered why schools were named McKinley and Roosevelt. Now I know why. Now I'm more angered why they were named that. So I'm here to learn, the history that I didn't learn in school up on the hill.
Oh, that's cool. Pat.
I'm Pat Kizimba, Hui Aloha Aina, Kale Maile Alii. Heard Ron's talk on Joseph Nawahi last year and was really excited by it and have been following you on Facebook and learning a lot more. That's my new history book, Facebook, your Facebook page.
Awesome. Robert. Bob.
Hi. I'm Bob Swar. I'm from Connecticut, and I'm a history buff, and I'm interested in several aspects of the history. One, the connections between Hawaii and Connecticut, and secondly, many people consider the overthrow the beginning of the American century, or many historians consider it to be the beginning of the American century. So that's my interest.
Catherine.
I'm Catherine Heuser, and I'm from Connecticut also. I'm doing research on Queen Emma and her letters and looking for her journals.
What happened?
And have been coming out to Hawaii about 8 years now doing research.
We okay? You want to stop for a bit?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
We get car traffic and stuff like that, so come on down. Oh, you're ready? Okay, okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Sylvia, we're on you.
Oh,
I'm
Sylvia.
Sylvia Prieston Red, a member of the HA'a and KLMA, and I've been a committed member for about 40 years.
Who did I not get? Oh, sorry, Karen.
Karen Kahn. I lived part of the year here in Barton, Massachusetts, so I've always been really interested in the history of Hawaii since I make a home here, and I also have always been interested in the history of resistance. And Joseph Nawahi is really interested in history.
Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen on that side.
Aloha, I'm Yuki Akioka, and I teach Papamala'o at Kekula Kaipuni and Kuahala. Isn't it my ohana? Type of thing. And then Walia. And I'm here because my wife said
come.
Yes. Got it.
So I'm here.
You're coming.
Hold on to that woman.
I'm happy to be here.
Oh, we have a Kula Kaipuni named Nawahi Otanyopu.
Hi, thank you, yes.
Awesome.
Yes.
This is Kalai, my wife.
Have to learn more.
That's right.
Aloha.
Okay, so what we're going to do today is I don't want to keep you out here too long. So we're going to go through kind of a biography. I'm going to leave time at the end for questions. So any questions you have about Nawahi, please ask. Don't be shy. If I can't answer them, I will. So that'll give us a chance to kind of talk about what you find interesting in it. So we're going to go through the biography. I made these for you guys to take home. You can take something away.
I want one of those too.
After the talk and after the kind of question and answer, we're going to claim space. For those who want to, not everyone has to, for those who want to, I brought the all-important sidewalk chalk. Yeah. So when I taught Hawaiian Studies at Makaku, my students came from all over. Mostly came from the United States. Only a few locals in the class. Well, not a few, but mostly locals, or mostly people from the United States. And I tried to tell them the importance of language, Hawaiian language, and making it and claiming space and letting people see it. Right? How many times does the average student hear Hawaiian that's not in Hawaiian Studies, Hawaiian language? Hardly ever, right? So Makaku taught that class, Hawaiian Studies 107. Almost every student has to take it. So we get about 1,200 students a day coming down to Makaku. So I'd bring my students out and I'd have them choose a Hawaiian word and they'd write it on the sidewalk. And so 1,200 students a day walk by and go, what is that? And see Makonalavai. At least see Hawaiian language. And they're aware that it exists. That's what I'm hoping that we can do today. Is say, do you have a message for Nawahi on his birthday? Do you want to say a Hawaiian word? Do you want to write his name? Do you want to say this is where his house was? Whatever you want to say to Nawahi, you've got the tools now. We've got to be careful. We don't want anybody getting run over. So whether it's sidewalk, whether it's here, whether it's there, whether it's where his home is, it's up to you. But we'll have a chance to claim this space and let people. This washes off. It's not toxic. It's okay. But for the next 24 hours or so, people that drive by, people that walk by will say, oh, something around here has to do with Nawahi. And we'll start to claim that space for him, if just temporarily. Kumu Cruz, Emily and others brought gifts, brought ho'okupu, but also brought pohaku. Maybe we turn this into a project where long term we ask the county and city and county, to put a plaque and say this is where Nawahi's home was. Those things are so important to start claiming that space back. Okay? So that's what's going to happen. This is Iosepa Kaho'oluhi Nawahi o Kalani o Pu'u. Right? Ika olelo keola, ika olelo kamake. Right? In language there's life, in language there's death. We don't say big full names to be fancy or to impress people. We say them because that's the family name. You give mana to that family name by pronouncing the name correctly and saying the name. The PG, the Republic, referred to the Queen all the time as Lili'u on purpose, because it was a shortening of her name. She was referred to in the papers as Her Majesty Queen Lili'u Kalani, right? It's important we say those names. I tell my students, you didn't go out drinking last night on Kalakaua Boulevard, you went on Kalakaua, right? The Kahako is there. Why is it important? Small kind deal, right? Why is it important? Because by saying his name, He Inoa no Kalakaua, you give mana to that ohana. Same thing with Nawahi. So we can practice, calling him Iosepa Kaho'oluhi Nawahi o Kalani o Pu'u. Okay? That's his name. Kanaka Oiwi, man of brilliant distinction, earned through a plethora of works during a remarkably full life. Iosepa Nawahi has earned a prominent spot on any list of central figures in the history of Hawaii. Through his service to individual people, the institutions he was a part of, and his nation as a whole, this Hawaiian Kingdom patriot has earned the designation of Aloha Aina Oia I'o, a true Hawaiian patriot. Yeah? So let's look at his life a little bit. Now, I put stuff on the back, and I want to give a disclaimer. I almost always fully translate, and I do that because many in the community don't have Olelo, right? Today I chose not to. And the reason was because that's the feeling I had. When I was making this up, I felt like we should keep this Olelo Hawaii. What I'm going to do is go through it really carefully and explain it. So it's not exclusive at all. We're going to tell everybody exactly what it says. But I think on this day, honoring him, we keep it Olelo Hawaii, right? So let's walk through it. 1842 to 1896. Hanau Ia, he was born 13 Ioanali, I can't even pronounce that, Ianuali, 1842, Ikaapana o Ka'imu, right? The district of Ka'imu. Ikamoku o Puna, in the Moku of Puna. Many of you know, sorry if I'm repeating this, but Hawaiian land divisions, right? You had ili, you had districts, you had Apana, things like that. Those were inside of Ahupua'a. Ahupua'a were inside of Moku, right? Oahu's got 6 big Moku. And then the Mokopuni was the island, right? So you've got your district, you've got your Ahupua'a, you've got your Moku, you've got your Mokopuni, you've got the nation. So when we write it out, we have Ikapana o Ka'imu, Ikamoku o Puna, Ikamokopuni o Hawaii, Iko Hawaii Pai Aina, right? So he was born in Puna in this area called Ka'imu. His father, Makuakane, Nawahi o Kalani o Pu'u. That was his father. He was born to high rank. He didn't talk about it a lot. We don't talk about it a lot, but he was Kaukaua. He was a high-ranking Alii. His mother, Keavea Olalo, also known as, I'm missing a vowel there, Ke'evi Lekini. Yeah, Ke'evi Lekini. Okay, A'o Palapala is his schooling. Now, a couple of notes I want to mention about schooling. When we come at these things as European trained historians or Western trained historians, we tend to say, what was that person known for, right? Nawahi was known as a great orator. Gave some of the greatest speeches ever in the legislature. So a Western historian doing his biography would say, okay, so where do you go to school? What college did you go to? Where did he learn that? As a Kanaka scholar, as a Kanaka type scholar doing that work, where do you start when finding out who he is? Right? Nawahi's father, grandfather, those folks were known as great orators. That's where he got the skill. Not to say that he didn't pick up the tools in school, but understanding that the story of him doesn't start with his birth. It starts with his mo'oko'ahau, right? So, 1853, Kahalikula Hanai Ho o Hilo, Hilo boarding school. So he goes to Hilo boarding school, which was a feeder school for Lahaina Luna. A lot of the future teachers, pastors, things like that, were going to Hilo boarding school and then going on to Lahaina Luna. That was the mission training. So he goes to Hilo boarding school in 1853. Ke Kulanui o Lahaina Luna, 1857. So graduating from Hilo boarding school, he's sent to Lahaina Luna. Lahaina Luna is the top of the top. It's those folks who are becoming literate and writing and thinking. He's there at Lahaina Luna till 57, and then he continues his education at Kekula Alii o Kahehuna, the Royal School of Kahehuna, 1861. So he's had a mission training throughout his life, right? He's gotten this education. He's a Christian. 1872, he starts his run, Hale Aho Olelo Kau Kanavai, right? The legislature. 1872, he's elected as a House of Representatives representative for Puna. 1874, 76, 78, 80, 82, 84, 90, and so on. He continues on in that legislature. He's elected by his people of Puna and then Hilo, on and on again. Right? He's got that mandate of the people. Heloyo Kanaka Oivi, he's a native Hawaiian lawyer. In 1878, he goes before the Supreme Court and takes a application to become a lawyer. Now there was no bar association yet. Lawyers usually trained under haole lawyers, whether it be Thurston or anyone, and then they could become lawyers if they passed the test. So Nawahi applies, and no one's heard of it. Who is this guy Nawahi? So he comes in, they say, where were you schooled? And he says, I wasn't. He did it on his own. He read the law books, he studied on his own. He goes before the Supreme Court, Albert Francis Judd, in 1878, and he takes the test and doesn't miss a single question. And he impresses them with his training. I said, who'd you train under? And he says, I didn't train under anybody. I studied this stuff. Right? So he becomes a lawyer in 1878. The Hawaii State Archives, we have his application, we have his supporting documents, and we have his license. So if you want to come into the state archives, public archives, you can access them, you can photograph them, they can be yours. You can print them out. All those primary source documents are there. 1880, he applied to become a lawyer to be able to be heard in all the courts of the land, up to the Supreme Court. And he passes that test flawlessly also. So a brilliant man, a great orator, beloved by his people, is now a lawyer. What does he do as a lawyer? He fights law cases, water cases, land cases for his people, often taking no money, and going before the court and arguing the case of the people. So that's 1878 and on. Au'aulahui Ho'opolole, the National Reform Party. So Nawahi is in the government. We know that in 1863, Boston has pulled their support, folks from New England, Boston had pulled their support from the mission and said, you guys did it. You created a Christian nation. Hawaii is now a Christian nation. Now come home. Some of the sons of the mission and the grandsons of the mission kind of liked it here, and they had positions of power. They had gained land in the Maile and so forth. So they said, well, we kind of like it here. I think we'll stay. And they weren't really happy about turning over power within the churches. And so they started a new association called the Ahui Wanolio o Hawaii. And that is an association of the Hawaiian churches across the island, and the sons of the mission are running that. Very important distinction between those first missionaries and the sons and grandsons. The first missionaries arrived, they weren't allowed to take money, they weren't allowed to be in the government, they weren't allowed to get involved in politics. The sons are taking a different route. So when we talk about, quote, the missionaries, we have to be very careful to separate that 1863 binary, right? So in 63, those sons of the mission start to push back against Alexander Liho, Lot Kapuiva, and the different mo'i. Alexander Liho has gone to the legislature, asked for money to build a hospital, and they said no. He had to go out and collect the money himself. So when Lot Kapuiva comes into power, he says, I refuse to take an oath to that constitution. He institutes a new constitution that brings power back to the monarchy. So now the native Hawaiian monarchy has more power. So these folks are going to push back. So they start to challenge Lot, also William Charles Lilo, and then especially Kalakaua when he comes into power. Kalakaua and those missionaries come to a heads of a fight. Now Kalakaua, it's important to be straight about this. Kalakaua came into his position as on the backs of the American missionary labor, of the sugar growers. Kalakaua and Emma in that election in 1874, the people were for Emma, no question. Nawahi was one of Emma's biggest supporters. Nawahi and Pilipo went around the islands and made speeches for Queen Emma, saying she is the one we should elect, right? But the election wasn't among the people, it was in the legislature. So the legislature gathers together and votes Kalakaua king. Now, the normal investiture, the normal ceremony where you take the oath and become the actual king, happened at Kawaiha'o Church every time. People were invited, the public was invited, 5,000 people. Kalakaua didn't do that. The riots that erupted during his election meant that he called American and British ships ashore. Over 70 Hawaiians, mostly Emmaites, were arrested, went to jail. The next day, he held a hastily arranged conference on the grounds of the palace at the Chamberlain's house, and that's where his investiture took place. So he comes into power kind of not with the backing of the people. So he moves forward, pushing the Reciprocity Treaty, which he did. Now, another misnomer is the Reciprocity Treaty, at first, didn't give away Pearl Harbor. It was simply a trade, taxes for taxes. Hawaiians refused to let that happen. It's a whole other story. Meetings across the islands, Kaumakapili Church, not this one, but the old one, meetings across the island saying we do not give up property, we do not give up our sovereignty to any nation. So Charles Reed Bishop wrote a letter to Washington, D.C. and said every Hawaiian in the islands is against this idea, including my own wife, Nawahi. So they can't push it through. So Kalakaua goes to the United States to push through just a tax-for-tax reciprocity treaty. He becomes the first head of state, the second head of state to ever address the legislature, the first head of state to ever address a joint session of the U.S. Congress, 1874. Yeah? So Kalakaua does that. Nawahi is an Emmaite, so he starts to get involved in this independent party, this push to kind of, keep a check on Kalakaua. Folks have written about Kalakaua as being anti-Hawaii, or kind of you never talk about the fact that he was against the Kalakaua. Super important to remember, there's a difference between the mo'i and the government, right? Kalakaua was an important check, along with Pilipo, on Kalakaua's. Kalakaua, at one point, was asking to borrow $1 million from the United States, to take out a loan of $1 million. Nawahi gets up and gives a speech. Now this speech that he gives is often placed with the reciprocity treaty, but that's not right. This speech he gives was about that $1 million loan. And he gets up in front of Congress. Now this guy from Puna, Hawaii, gets up in front of the Congress in 1874 and gives one of the greatest speeches ever given in the Congress. And he talks about the fact, he says, this borrowing $1 million is not going to do good for us. And I want to tell you a story that tells you why. There's an experience that happened that's going to happen to us. And he says these two great nations in the world were having a war, a battle for years and years and years. And there was no breakthrough, no side won, and more people died, and it was just a stalemate. And finally, one nation said, okay, let's call a pause, let's call a truce. As a matter of fact, we're going to offer you a gift of truce. And that truce was a huge built wooden horse. Yeah. And they rolled the horse inside the fort buildings, right? It's the story of the Trojan horse. Nawahi was telling the story of the Trojan horse to the Hawaiian Kingdom legislature in 1874. That tells you how up-to-date he was, how his political theory was, how well-read he was. And he says, if we take this loan and become indebted to the United States, it's the first step towards annexation. He was prescient. He knew that. When he talks about the reciprocity treaty later on, he says the same thing. This is the first step towards annexation. We let one paw in, and then the whole animal will come in. Yeah? So Nawahi was ahead of his time in that, and telling his fellow legislatures about that. So Kalakaua is, along with the other gentleman that I mention all the time, William Pinohu White. He's one of the guys that's really supporting this struggle against Kalakaua. The Haole sugar growers are against Kalakaua also. So there's some issues where they kind of meet on, say, no, we should push, so forth. But the moment it became apparent that the Haole sugar growers were going to push for a takeover of the kingdom, Nawahi said no, right? He wasn't anti the government, he was anti some issues that Kalakaua was putting forward. There's a difference between being a loyalist and a royalist, right? We tend to beatify the monarchy sometimes, and I'm not here to pick on the monarchy, but they're people who made decisions. To Nawahi and to many others, the lahui was the question. The lahui was what mattered, right? So folks, you see him sometimes criticize Kalakaua, but the moment the nation was endangered, no, you don't do that. So that's where Nawahi and White and those folks start to turn. And they put up a fight. So, the reciprocity treaty is coming due. It's gotten the sugar growers filthy rich, literally millionaires. They've made a lot of money, but in 1887 it's going to come and it's going to end. And so they're pushing for a renewal of the Treaty of Reciprocity. So the king sends out a renewal to the U.S., and the U.S. says, nah, this isn't good for us. We haven't made money on it. It's really not helping us. It's hurting our sugar growers. We don't want to do it unless you give us Pearl Harbor. So now the new treaty is going to be Pearl Harbor. And Kalakaua says no. So those sugar growers, those businessmen, they're stuck. They've got to get this treaty passed. That's the birth of the 1887 coup. In January of 1887, they get together at Dr. McGrew's house, Thurston, Dole, and all those guys, and they start a group called the Hawaiian League. It was a secret, all-white organization whose constitution literally said, we implement things that will bring whites to power in Hawaii. We have their constitution, we have every name on the roll, we have the words there, this isn't made up. They said, we want white power in Hawaii. So they start that group in 1887, January. Now the Honolulu Rifles, which we've all heard about, begun in the 1850s as a private militia, not a government militia, it's a private militia, kind of like Blackwater, right? But it served the king. The king could call it out when he needed help to quell a riot or something like that. So the Honolulu Rifles was a good thing for the kingdom. But in 1887, it comes under the control of the Hawaiian League. So the Hawaiian League takes over that as their military wing, and they bring in hundreds and hundreds of new haole into the Honolulu Rifles. And that becomes the military force for the Hawaiian League. So they're pushing back against Kalakaua, they're pushing back against Kalakaua. 1887 is rolling around, the summer comes, and they launch a coup. Now there were different factions inside of that Hawaiian League. Basically the Dole faction and the Thurston faction. Dole was relatively judicial. Let's do this, we can amend the Constitution, we can do this. The Thurston faction said, literally, it's written down, let's kill Kalakaua and declare a republic. Let's just take over and have a white-led republic of Hawaii in 1887. That faction didn't win out, Dole's faction did, and they brought the Bayonet Constitution, forced Kalakaua to sign it, and so forth. So the reaction is a new election, but now many Native Hawaiians are disenfranchised. All Asians are disenfranchised. Chinese and Japanese had the vote as Kingdom of Hawaii citizens since the 1854 Constitution. The Bayonet Constitution explicitly removes them from the rolls. Asians are not allowed to vote. So now it's the haole, some Hawaiians, and the income clause is raised. So it's richer people. So Nawahi, despite that, despite the new clause, despite all the disenrollment of Hawaiians from the rolls, Nawahi and William White win their elections in 1890. And they come in and say, we're going to change the Constitution. We're going to get rid of bayonet. And there's two ways to do that. The legislature and the monarchy. And so they say, let's push a constitutional convention in the legislature. And Joseph Nawahi is the leader of a bill to call a constitutional convention to get rid of bayonet constitution. William White also helps him. But they just get outvoted barely every time. And so they go to the Queen, and the Queen writes about this in her diary. William Punoa White, Joseph Nawahi, and Sam Nolan go to the Queen and say, we must have a new constitution. And the Queen herself is reticent. She says, I wasn't sure it was the right time. I wasn't sure we could do this. But she says, Nawahi and White talked me into it and told me this was the thing that needed to happen. So they work with her, Nawahi, White, and Nolan work with her to form a new constitution, and they draft that constitution. That brings back votes to all the people, that brings back power to the monarchy, and so forth. And so word gets out that this is happening. The haole are making their plans. We can't let this happen. We finally got control. Let's stop this messing around and half power and controlling the king. Let's just take over. And they work with Minister Stevens, who comes here in 1891, to make a plan to overthrow the Queen and take over. So they meet with Stevens. Stevens says, the way you do it is this. You take over. I recognize you. We're good. Send an annexation treaty and so forth. Nawahi and White are working on the Constitution for the Queen. On January 14th, 1893, everybody in town is called to the palace to hear something. And they all know what it is. And that is, for the first time in many, many years, Hawaiians will retake the government and have control of the government. Fully. That new constitution. And so they're ecstatic. And the men wear their hats and their tails, and the women are all in their best dresses. And they come down to the palace grounds, 7,000 Native Hawaiians at the palace. And they're waiting to hear the new constitution. That morning, that's going to be at 2:00 p.m. That morning, the Queen meets with Joseph Nawahi and William White in the palace, in the Blue Room. And she knights both of them Knights Order of Kalakaua, the highest award in the kingdom. She says it's for their work as patriots in drafting this new constitution. Those were the last two royal orders ever issued by the kingdom. It was Joseph Nawahi and William White. And she writes in her biography the quote that I put on the back of the thing here. I'll read it for you. She's talking about Nawahi and William White. The behavior of these two patriots during the trying scenes of this session, in such marked contrast to that of many others, won them profound respect. They could never be induced to compromise principles, nor did they for one moment falter or hesitate in advocating boldly a new constitution which should accord equal rights to the Hawaiians, as well as protect the interests of the foreigners. The true patriotism and love of country of these men had been recognized by me, and I had decorated them with the Knights Commander of Kalakaua, Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani. So she awards Nawahi and White the last two awards awarded on the 14th. She goes across the street to the legislature building, and she's going to prorogue the legislature. She's going to end the legislature for that year. And she meets with them, and she says, you've done a good job, congratulations. She gives a speech. She prorogues the legislature. Now she's going to go across the street and have her cabinet sign the new constitution, which they've all promised to do. Hui Kalai Aina group that came before Hui Aloha Aina. Hui Kalai Aina is the patriotic group of that day. Their head is a man named Joseph Alapa'i. How many, raise your hand if you've heard of Alapa'i. I mean, this is the man who ran Hui Kalai Aina, who carried the Constitution for the new Queen to the Queen to be signed. That's the state of Hawaiian history we're in, right? But Alapa'i is carrying it on gold chains, walking across, as 30 of his officers with him are walking across to the palace behind the Queen carrying the Constitution. They go in the blue room. The Queen says, I present you the Constitution. Two of the cabinet ministers say, you know what, we've changed our minds, we can't sign. They've met with Thurston about 2 hours ago in his office, and Thurston and Dole have Soper there, the Marshall Kingdom, with them, and they say, we're going to take over, the American Marines are going to be landed, and General Soper has our back too. And those two ministers say, I want to hear it from Stevens. Stevens tells them, yes, this is going to happen, and so they say, you better be on the right side. And so they back out and they refuse to sign the Constitution. Now she could have just proclaimed it, like the bayonet was, but she wanted to do it legally. And she knew this was crazy that was going on. So she goes out on the palace balcony, Lanai, and she talks to the people and she gives a speech in Hawaiian, and she tells them, I'm sorry, I cannot proclaim the Constitution today, but it will happen. Go in peace. William White and Joseph Nawahi both speak to the crowd and talk about that they need to go in peace, that this will be taken care of. So we know that the next day the U.S. Marines are landed. 2 days later, the U.S. Marines are landed on the 16th. The 17th, we have the proclamation. A guy literally reading a thing like this, and Stevens recognizing him. For those of you who don't know, inside the archives of Hawaiian mission houses recently have new documents have come forward. The original protest of the Queen. Also a letter from Minister Stevens admitting that they did not have control when he proclaimed them the provisional government. So admitting falsities, admitting that he lied to Congress. It's all right there, black and white. So this happens. Joseph Nawahi and others gathered together in March of 1893, and they found Hui Aloha Aina. Hui Hawaii Aloha Aina. And they found branches across the islands. They come to form about, my numbers aren't exact because I'm trying to remember, but about 8,000 men, about 11,000 women are actually members of the branches. They form branches across the islands. Joseph Nawahi is elected president of Hui Kalai Aina. They push for a restoration of the Queen. Minister Willis is appointed the new minister after the Congress has kicked out Stevens. President Cleveland reads the Blount Report. The President of the United States, not me or you or any other person, the President of the United States says this is an act of war that should not happen, and a call for our country's right means we must repair it. He says the Queen will be put back into power. He sends Minister Willis to Hawaii. Minister Willis meets with the Queen. They work out a deal. He goes to the provisional government and says, you've got to step down. And once again, we have those two factions. Dole says, okay, we lost. Says, yeah, as long as we got our rights back, as long as they don't do anything to us, throw us in jail, we're cool. Thurston says, no, I think they're bluffing. I think the president's not going to have U.S. Marines fire on Americans to put a brown woman back as Queen of Hawaii. And he was right. Cleveland said put her back, but he didn't give them military, he didn't allow them to use military to bring them back. It was just a threat. Thurston calls the bluff, and the Americans stand down. So now, the provisional government, who's been begging the U.S. to annex them, they tell the U.S., butt out, this is none of your business. This is an internal affair. So President Cleveland withdraws the troops. We have 1894, the Republic declared, and so forth. And we have this kind of stalemate. So at that point, America becomes an enemy of the Republic. Right? So Joseph Nawahi is pushing for the new Constitution. Time has gone by. People are realizing the U.S. isn't going to follow up on its promise. And so a military attempt starts to be organized to bring the Queen back. This has been happening for a long time. We're just starting to delve into records in Japanese language newspapers, Chinese language newspapers, and so forth. And what we're finding is guns and weapons were being hidden on the plantation by the Japanese and Chinese for the Hawaiians. So because their rights were taken away in the 1887 bayonet. They were angry too. And so you have this military attempt starting to form. They purchased guns from San Francisco. In January of 1895, a boatload of guns lands at Sanssouci. They unload the guns, they bury them in the sand. Yeah? About 3 days later, some folks are down there uncovering the guns, cleaning them, getting them ready, and the Republic Guards stumble across them. A fire breaks out. Joseph Carter, a Republic Guard, is killed. That begins the Kawakuloko of 1895, the rebellion of 1895. So we all know about there's 400 and something folks now. I'm working on a project now with their photographs and everything. 400 and something folks who were arrested. Some of them in battle, some of them just because they were Hawaiian leaders. But prior to all of this, Nawahi had been put in prison. Nawahi had been put in prison as a preemptory strike against rumors of an overthrow. So on December 9th, 1894, the Republic of Hawaii served a search warrant on his home, which was right where that white car is, about 2 feet into the road, was the site of his home. His property stretched all the way across here. But so the Republic of Hawaii Marshal comes here, serves a search warrant on his home and says, you're conspiring to overthrow the government, you've got guns and weapons in your house. We've heard rumors. They go into the house, they don't find anything, but they arrest him anyway. They go to Bush's house, a newspaper editor, John Bush, and they go to Crick's house and they arrest them. They found 5 or 6 rifles in one of their houses. They bring them all to prison, they arrest them for conspiracy, and they're convicted. And Joseph Nawahi goes to Oahu prison. He's in prison. The conditions there are very poor, disease-ridden prison. He contracts tuberculosis. That tuberculosis is the reason of his death. He caught his death disease in prison. He's released about 8 months later. He comes out of prison weak. His wife tells him, Emma tells him, you need to rest. You need to put aside your kuleana. And he says, no, I'm here to fight for the people. They start the newspaper, Ke Aloha Aina. They're putting out newspapers. He's fighting against the Republic. He's doing all of these things. And he gets sicker and sicker and sicker. He finally goes to, the doctors tell him to go get good air in San Francisco. That's what they told. That's why Kalakaua went too. They thought if you travel across the ocean, it's a good thing. So he goes to San Francisco. He'd been there earlier in the 1870s. Nawahi went and traveled into San Francisco. If you've ever been there, there's this place called Woodward's Gardens. It was an old kind of exposition place. Nawahi rode a hot air balloon at Woodward's Gardens, and he writes about it. His biography is brilliant. It's online, in Hawaiian and English. So he goes back to San Francisco. He's there in San Francisco, and he gets sicker and sicker and sicker. He's at the hotel. He calls his wife to his bedside, and he recites his last words. And I'm going to read those for you. We'll read those. I have a speech that I want to kind of see if we can get through that he wrote, because I want to read some of his words, and then we'll move on to questions, and then we'll wrap it up so we're not out here in the sun too long. But these are the last words of Joseph Nawahi. So this is the translation of Puakea Nogomeyer, Dr. Nogomeyer. He says, Mama, he's talking to his wife, he says, Mama, be hopeful. You may be a widow when you return to Hawaii, but God takes care of widows and orphans. Mama, I look upon you with great suffering. Please forgive me for my bringing you to this foreign land, for you to labor alone towards my health. That is the reason why this misfortune has come about, just as the doctor said. So he's apologizing for bringing her away from Hawaii to take care of him. I persist in working when my body was weak, and it would be difficult now to save me. That is so. May the Lord watch over the dear fatherless children of his servant. When he finished his remarks, he clasped his hands over his chest, closed his eyes, and fell into a comfortable and calm sleep. Where is it? I'm sorry, I read you the second paragraph first. So back up. Back up. So he's talking to his wife. He's talking to his wife now, and he says, fetch a pen and some paper and come close to the bed here. He asked the date and the time, which I told him. And he spoke again. Mama, don't you worry about me. I'm just going to talk with you, and you should write it down so you don't forget. If I should die here, let me be taken back to Hawaii. In everything concerning us and the children, you shall have control over that, and everything should be settled by you. Do not select a trustee or executor as usual with everyone. Kiss your sister and those beautiful children of ours. Give my love to the family, to our close friends, and to all of our associates. Give my love to my queen and the nation that I have loved, and speak for me on my behalf. Continue to be steadfast in your love for the land. And then he made his last remarks and passed away. His body was brought back here to Hawaii. They buried him in one of the greatest state funerals Hawaii had ever seen. Emma brought his body around to the different islands for people to see. When he came to Lahaina, Hui Aloha Aina o Mala'ulu Olele rode out to meet his body. That happened in Hana, that happened on Kauai, and everywhere. had over 7,000 people at his funeral, and he was buried at Homalani Cemetery. Unfortunately, executors did take over his probate. The people who owned the land were the gentlemen who had overthrown the queen, the Thurstons, the Doles, and the Castles, and so forth. They closed in on her mortgages. At one point, they told her, they threatened her with declaring her son a leper if she did not sign over certain properties. And they ended up kind of breaking her will, yeah? So, she writes a letter to the queen that's really remarkable. In the midst of all this, in the midst of, and somebody asked me to mention something about Emma today, so that's why I'm doing it. It's Joseph's Day, but we need to mention Emma too. So she writes a letter to Queen Lili'u in 1897 when the queen is in Washington. So her husband has died, she's lost all the property, she has a little place that she's still living on. And she writes the queen and says, she's leasing the press from one of the other guys who prints newspapers. He triples the rate of the press overnight. So she can't afford to put out Ke Aloha Aina anymore. And so she says to the queen, she tells the queen this. The queen writes her back and says, don't worry, I'll send you money. And Emma writes back to her and says, no, you keep your money. You need to take care of the lahui. I'll figure it out. So in the midst of all of that, in the midst of these pressures, in the midst of the foreclosures, in the midst of her husband dying, she takes care of her own, right? She takes care of her own kuleana, and she continues to push the press. Joseph would have been proud, yeah? So Joseph dies, he's buried. The reason why I wanted to kind of talk about this site and bring us here is because his love for the lahui was bigger than just his adoration of the monarchy. I talked a little bit earlier about royalists and loyalists. I printed something out that, of course, the last minute I forgot to bring, but I do have it on my computer. Now you know how I work, last minute. I do have it on my computer, and so maybe a few of us will read it. If I can get a few of us to read it. This is a letter that Joseph Nawahi wrote to Queen Lili'u. And this, to me, is one of the most important things that we bring into our history of understanding Hawaii. It was about a lahui. Yeah? People say all the time it's not about one leader. It's about a lahui. And Nawahi knew that. In 1894, there were lots of rumors going around about the restoration of the queen. One of the rumors was the queen was going to sign over sovereignty to the U.S. for a certain amount of money. That for $100,000, because they were taking everything from her. And one of the rumors was, for a certain amount of money, she was going to sign over sovereignty. So the people asked Joseph to talk to her and make sure this is not true. Can you imagine the difficulty of going to the queen and questioning her and stuff like that? But he does it, and he does it in a beautiful way. But the letter blew me away because he's stern in it. He's talking to the queen very respectfully, but saying, sovereignty does not rest with you, it rests with the people. And I've never seen a letter from somebody to the queen reminding her that she was a servant of the people. And that's what Joseph Nawahi did. So I want to read that letter, and I'll help other people, maybe will help me. And then we'll finish up. So this is a letter to let you know. I'm going to read some and I'm going to pass it to somebody.
Pass it to some of our folks on that side too.
Okay. So this letter, I implore all of you to take a day and come down to the State Archives. I'm working there temporarily. I got an 89-day hire, so they don't have to pay me insurance. So I'm working there temporarily on special projects, and the things they have are amazing, and it's open to the public. You can walk in and see anything they have in that archive. There's nothing that they won't show you. Now, there's certain things they have to have the archivist turn the pages and so forth because they're delicate. But those documents are your documents. And then Adam Jansen, who's state archivist, talks about that all the time. In there is a collection of documents that was stolen. I said that the other day in the Attorney General. We were in a meeting with the Attorney General. And the Attorney General said, no, they were seized. I said they were stolen. I repeated myself. So when the Queen is arrested in 1895, she's arrested. Albert Francis Judd and the Attorney General go to her home, Washington Place, her private home, and they break open her safe and take everything out of her safe. In there was about 300 letters and documents of her most precious things that she wanted that meant the most to her. There's letters from Hui Aloha Aina women across the islands giving their support. There's people who were kind of helping her out, telling her what was going on. There's all kinds of stuff, including this letter from Joseph Nawahi. So this was in her safe. So all these documents are today at the State Archives. And it's in, this is Mapolelo Haole, and there's no marks on it, so I don't know if it's a translation or if the original was in Hawaiian, I don't know. All I know is we only have the translation, or the English. To Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani, and I ask you to listen closely. Listen to the terms he uses. Listen to the way he speaks to her. Sovereign of the Hawaiian Kingdom. May it please your gracious Majesty, the undersigned, loyal, and respectful subjects of the Hawaiian Kingdom and of your Majesty take the liberty of humbly submitting to your Majesty what follows, to wit, that they are officers of the executive body of a political association called the Hui Aloha Aina o Hawaii, embracing a membership of over 8,000 registered voters, united for the express purpose of preserving the integrity of the Hawaiian monarchy under your Majesty's rule. That in their above capacity, and in virtue of that delegation unto them, given by the members of the said associations, the undersigned here, ever since the revolution of January 17, 1893, used all of their endeavors, efforts, power, and influence, and those of the members of the association, through organization, meetings, petitions, testimony, and other legal means, for the object of helping to bring about the restoration of your Majesty as sovereign of this kingdom. That these efforts, attended at times with danger to themselves and properties, and to the lives of properties of the members unto followers of their leadership, have created between themselves and their followers a reciprocal bond of interest, obligations, and responsibilities, whereby the members of the association expect from the aforementioned officers and executive body the proper information, news, and instruction for their guidance, and expect them to attend to all objects of the association of carrying out the political measures necessary for the restoration of the Hawaiian monarchy on a firm basis, whereby the autonomy of the nation and the peace and prosperity of its inhabitants may be secured forever. That among the foremost measures expected by your people and promised by our association is the promulgation by your Majesty of a new constitution, more just and liberal for your own people, and finally that the members of the association will look out to the undersigned in their above capacities and hold them responsible for any failure in the carrying out of such measures, as desired and deemed necessary by your people.
Therefore, the undersigned feel that it is an imperious duty of theirs to respectfully present to your Majesty that members of the Hui Aloha Aina are at present laboring under serious
apprehensions
and fears, lest through ill-advised and hasty concessions, the future of the kingdom may be jeopardized, and at the very moment when the impending restoration of your Majesty would otherwise fill the hearts of your people with gladness and fulfill the wishes of your faithful subjects, who have been bravely standing by your Majesty through all these long months of dangers, insults, and anxious waiting.
So they've been hearing the rumors that she's going to give up the kingdom.
It has been announced by the local papers and not contradicted that Minister Willis, after negotiating with your Majesty personally and secretly, without the advice of any real representatives of your people, has requested the provisional government to surrender on condition of your Majesty promising to respect the old bayonet constitution of 1887 and agreeing to grant the rebels who have attempted to sell the country
So they've heard that the Queen met with Minister Willis and made a deal. And Nawahi is saying to her, you can't make a deal. You have to consult with the people. Right? The people have a say in this. Because the rumor is she's going to agree to keeping the bayonet constitution just to remain in power. That she'll give up the fight for a new constitution. So Nawahi is reminding her, you've got to talk to us. Right? So, No. Okay. It has been announced by the local papers, you read that. On this matter, we wish to be allowed to state, number one, the restoration being not a favor, but an obligation of justice on the American government, ought to be done without any restrictive conditions. No deals, no restrictions, restore our Queen. And your Majesty owes to the Hawaiian people. Think about how difficult that must have been to say. Your Majesty owes to the Hawaiian people who have stood by you to now stand by them and not sacrifice one iota of their rights. Therefore, in the event of your majesty considering that certain concessions might be granted, only such as may be personal to your majesty ought to be acceded to privately. But any conditions interesting the whole nation, such as those especially of constitution and amnesty, ought not to be granted except after due consultation with the representatives of your people. And in the event of your majesty not considering your present cabinet as representing the nation, we claim that the nearest and most authoritative representatives of the people in the present circumstances are the officers of Hui Aloha Aina. Yeah? So he tells the queen, you don't have a cabinet anymore, you don't have advisors anymore, the most representative body of the people is Hui Aloha Aina, and you owe it to them to come talk to us, who have proved their loyalty to your person and their discretion and trustworthiness. Moreover, your majesty should remember that the entering by you in your official capacity into any secret agreement with Minister Willis would be a violation of all constitutional principles. It would not be binding on your restored cabinet, nor on any other that might follow, who has executive power, who would be responsible to the people for such agreements and their feel for consequences taken without their private consent. Number 2, in the matter of the Constitution, apart from desires and expectations of the Hawaiian people for a new instrument canceling the injustices of the last one, which has virtually been abrogated by the rebels themselves, your majesty should consider the consequences to yourself and to your people resulting from the restoration of the old Constitution. You must admit that through the odious and unjust property qualifications which have disenfranchised your native subjects in their own country and given virtual control of the elections to the moneyed class, those mortal enemies of your majesty and of your people, the old Constitution would again give back to those same enemies the legislative power of the land, which they would soon control again through their former money tactics. Number 3, the question of amnesty, letting the guys go who overthrew the government, is an equally dangerous and gets more so when combined with the constitutional one, since this would confirm to all the present rebels and enemies of our autonomy all their civil rights of electing and being elected, and of governing, and it is useless for us to state to your majesty how the bitter and unprincipled rebels would use those rights to steal your fate and that of your people. In fact, such an amnesty, together with keeping the old Constitution, our members consider that the country would be worse off than it is now, and that the past troubles would be sure to repeat themselves in a very short while. By your majesty conceding these 2 points, if the rumor be correct, you are therefore virtually surrendering yourself and your people to the enemy. And this is sufficient to justify our alarm and the misbodings of our association. But these sentiments of ours are further increased if we give credence to the rumor that these untimely and ruinous concessions, on which the Hui Aloha Aina have not been consulted, have been counseled to your majesty by certain unrepresentative advisors, whom your majesty well knows are disliked, mistrusted, and feared, for good reasons by all of your loyal subjects. Those advisors have done nothing for your majesty in the past crisis but cheap talk, while your majesty's strength lies in the fight made for you by Hui Aloha Aina. If your majesty is willing to run personally the dangers we allude to, it is a duty we owe to ourselves and to our families to protest and ask that at least you may not jeopardize the petition's interest and future, and nullify the efforts we have made to save our country from the pirates who have seized it. The undersigned hope that your majesty will excuse this plain talk, but, as they claim to have proven that none are more loyal and faithful subjects than them, they respectfully think that they are entitled to the favor of expressing before your majesty the opinions of their followers, and to a right also of being awarded some proof of confidence and trust. Moreover, in view of the responsibilities that weigh on their shoulders through the confidence of the members of the Hui, they wish to place themselves on record as having dutifully sounded the alarm, so that they may not be blamed if the members get discouraged and apathetic when they hear that their hopes and expectations of a good, stable, and just native government are frustrated. Of your majesty, the most humble and obedient subjects, Joseph Nawahi.
We should clap.
So, December 1893. Doesn't have a date. It's in English. We don't know if it's a translation or if it's the original. But think about that. I mean, December. So the Willis is talking to the Queen. These things are happening. I mean, I've never heard something like that addressed to the Queen, and I don't find it disrespectful. I don't think she did. But for me, it just reminded me that this was a constitutional monarchy. That as much as we aloha the Queen, and with no, loyalty to the Queen, it was about a lahui. Yeah? And that lahui at that time was represented by Hui Aloha Aina. So, those of us who are members of Hui Aloha Aina, I think that increases our kuleana. Yeah. So, with that said, we'll take some questions, and then we'll answer a few questions, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about what you guys feel like doing. I know I want to write something. because I have a message to send. Let's be safe. Let's watch for traffic. Let's watch out for each other. The sidewalk is public property. I wouldn't do it in the church. I wouldn't. His home is right over there on the street. So there's, you do what you feel compelled to do. I have chalk. You can write a letter and take it home with you. You can do anything like that. Those private ceremonies are your own. But with that said, I want to say before we take questions that I model all you guys. I happen to be the guy that gets to get up and talk about this and stuff like that. But to see all of you guys out here doing this really means a lot. Yeah, it really reminds me and reminds us and reminds my students that the community cares, that the folks are out there. It's a Saturday. It's a beautiful day out. A lot of places you could have been, but to come spend time on the side of a church in an alley, kind of hunched under a tree, means something. And I think that means something to Joseph Nawahi also. So, questions about Nawahi, about anything like that? Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence that Ambassador Stevens acted with the tacit approval of someone in Washington?
Oh, there's tons of evidence. Tons of evidence. Now, with that said, we make these generalizations about America did this. He had backers and supporters in America. It doesn't mean it was the president. It doesn't mean it was the cabinet. It was certain people. He, in general, had the backing of several military men, of several congressmen, and so forth. And then it was his own fervent belief that Hawaii should become part of the United States. He was the minister to Nicaragua prior to coming to Hawaii, and he tried to get Nicaragua annexed to the U.S. He was a former minister, congressional minister, who believed in manifest destiny. He believed every country should be run by white men. And so a lot of this was his passion, along with support back in Washington.
Right. Henry Cabot Lodge.
Sorry?
Henry Cabot Lodge.
Yeah, and others. Okay. So the problem is, we sometimes we look for, do we blame this group or not? It's not a yes or no. It's gray, and it's yes and no, and so forth. In my Mana'o, where we talk about the U.S., the overthrow was also very much a local group thing. Right. When history say, I still have a problem with the History Channel. When history say a group of American businessmen overthrew the Queen, that's simply not true. There were 13 men who led the Committee of 13. A majority of them were Hawaiian nationals. They were white. That was the thing that unified them. They were white businessmen. But some of these men had never been to America. Born and raised in Hawaii, sworn allegiance to the kingdom, and so forth. They were Hawaiian Kingdom subjects. So they were Hawaiian Kingdom subjects who committed treason by going against their pledge to the nation. Right? Now the U.S. comes in with the landing of the troops. That's their kuleana, 100%. And at the annexation, when America occupied and stole Hawaii. So I'm not saying the U.S. isn't to blame. Of course they are. But we need to keep those things straight about this. Is the blame of a local group of businessmen who pushed this thing. Yeah.
Okay, so with A and B still in power, like in Maui, where they make most of the rules and they make all the ruling, and with people from A and B sitting in the board of directors for land and natural resources, how can we move forward with this type of evidence to hold them accountable so that they can actually, so it can be reversed and action can be appropriately taken?
Incredibly important question that I don't answer because I'm a historian, not a poli-sci. What I would say is what I do: find a leader you trust, and work your ass off for them. But I know history. Not only does politics and law kind of confuse me, I also in a way think that my kuleana doesn't extend there. I'm not a Hawaiian Kingdom subject. It's not that I'm white. It's that I'm not a Hawaiian Kingdom subject. This isn't my land. I don't know that I should be telling people what to do about their political future. But I will tell you the truth about history. And I think that's part of it.
He found all the names of all of the people that were there talking, plotting, planning the overthrow. And all of those names are in his book in chapter 8 of Nation Within. Now, those were all Republicans. The Republican Party plotted, planned to take over. So I wish everybody would read the book and know that. And I think Republicans today should know about that.
It was, so her point is well taken. So Tom Kaufman's book, I think, is one of the best books written on the overthrow. There's a lot that he doesn't address, but the stuff he addresses, he researched incredibly well. And it tells the story from the American side, from what was going on back there. And he talks about Sewell and Dole, how all of these folks came from a few small towns in Maine. There was actually a club called the Hawaiian Club of Boston that started in the 1860s. And it's Thurston and Dole and all these folks, you know, early on. So yes, there was a connection to money people and business people and so forth back in Boston, Maine, and so forth.
For decades.
For decades. Well,
4 decades.
yeah. Well, and who's the general who came here in the 50s? Schofield. You know, General Schofield came here on a mission to find a deep water port for the U.S. Navy in the 1850s and mapped out Pearl Harbor. So there was definite interest, there was definite push, and so forth. I also caution to remember also that, you know, when we call Dole an American, we take away that cooling on to the fact that he swore allegiance to the Kingdom of Hawaii. He was born and raised here. Okay?
How many of them had dual citizenship?
Well, technically 0. so dual citizenship is a really great question that we're still grappling with, because dual citizenship, there is no international law on dual citizenship. It's up to each country whether or not they recognize it. So some of those folks, so being born and raised in Hawaii gave them Hawaiian Kingdom citizenship automatically. Some of them, a few of them, not many, Gulick and a couple others, went to the U.S. on missions, and while they were there, applied for passports and so forth and got American citizenship without telling them they had kingdom citizenship. So they were carrying 2 passports. But the kingdom only recognized one, and America only recognized one.
Did America only recognize one? Because today they allow dual citizenship.
Right.
At what point was the law changed?
I don't know when it changed. But there's a point. So one example is I'm researching the 1895 rebellion right now. Me and some friends are working on a book about the 1895 rebellion. When there's 6 Americans, born and raised Americans, who were in Hawaii during that, and they get arrested. First thing they do, back up. They were Americans who had come here in the 1880s and sworn allegiance to the kingdom. So they were voting in the kingdom. And they were Hawaiian Kingdom subjects. They had their American citizenship from birth, right? So they were voting in the kingdom election, swore allegiance to the kingdom. They were arrested. First thing they did was went to the American embassy and say, "Oh, help us, help us." The letters go back to the U.S. Minister Willis writes and says, "Can't help you. You swore allegiance to the kingdom of Hawaii under Kalakaua. You're not an American citizen anymore." So to America, they had given up their American rights by swearing allegiance, because the thought was you can't have allegiance to 2 different nations. You can't really serve 2 different nations.
But the bottom line comes down to where was their allegiance?
Right.
There's a lot of people who come in all the time who claim to be nationals of other countries, and then they overthrow the country.
Right.
So where is your allegiance?
Right. Well, that's what makes the difference between those folks who had some allegiance and overthrown those folks who reformed. So yeah, so that and they also try. It's a little off topic, but I'll mention it. So 1894, when they have the election for the Constitutional Convention for the Republic, they declared a republic. Only 4% of the country votes. A little less than 4. And that looks awful to them, because Hawaiians aren't voting, right? And so only 4% vote. And so they've got to beef up the rolls. And they don't want to beef up the rolls with brown people. So in July of 1894, they pass a law giving special rights of citizenship. It's not citizenship, it's the rights of citizenship. It's just the right to vote and so forth. They give that to anyone that can prove that they supported the provisional government and the republic. And you know who they grant 1,700 of these rights of citizenship. You know who 80% of them go to? I'm not picking on anybody. Portuguese. Go to the plantation, they say, "You 400 Portuguese, sign this." And they make them all able to vote, so that when the vote comes around, they can go back and say, "Vote for this guy," and so forth. And they almost double the rolls of white voters by granting rights of citizenship to Portuguese in 1894. So that they're always playing with that citizenship issue. Okay, who else? Yes.
Do you know if there's any connection to the group who met in the Metropolitan Club in Washington, D.C.? I'm speaking of Theodore Roosevelt, Alfred Thayer Mahan, Dewey.
Right. I don't know. Was it a Masonic thing or?
No, it's a private club still.
Yeah. No, I don't know.
How involved were the Masons?
I don't know. I know that Kalakaua was very involved in masonry. I know many of the elite were.
What about the other parts?
I don't know. No, I haven't studied that. I don't know.
Thanks.
Who else?
Since Thurston was a white supremacist,
Yeah.
and since white supremacy is being attacked so vigorously by many progressives across the U.S., wouldn't it make sense this year to attack things named Thurston here?
I like this guy.
Again, a political question.
I know that you can't answer it, but it was worth asking.
It's not a I think we should respect each other's choices. Can I ask a favor really quickly, and to put somebody on the spot, I don't mean to, but I think it's important that Leilani, could you share your mana'o for a couple of minutes about that letter that he wrote, what that means about Hui Aloha Aina, and what it means like for you to understand that kuleana that was placed with those people, and what it means to be there today. Yeah. Sorry.
It calls us to realize the kuleana that we all take upon ourselves as Hui Aloha Aina, representative of our lahui, not any one leader, unless we all come together as a lahui in agreement on that. And our kupuna laid that foundation for us to stand upon. We don't have to recreate the wheel or another organization. It remains, and it's a firm foundation for us to stand upon and follow in the way that they laid out for us. It's there.
Mahalo. If not, I'm going to bust out my little box of chalk. It's around here somewhere.
It's behind you.
Here it is. Again, please, foremost priority, be safe. Don't walk out in the middle of the street and not look around. I would recommend the sidewalks and things like that. If there's somebody around, maybe ask their permission. We don't want to, we want to respect the neighborhood. But if you have a message for Joseph, again, I'll just give you the facts that his homestead stood right over there on underneath the road where that white car is, and extended this way. So we were sitting on his property, but that's where his home was. Eventually, I would promote the idea that we all gather together to kind of push the idea to the county to put a marker, right? Yeah. Get the statues everywhere else. Let's put a marker where Joseph Nawahi lived in Oahu, where he was arrested.
Yes, political action now.
Yeah, I'm a political guy now.
That's an action we can all do.
So, okay, so or if you want to just take a minute and be with yourself, it's up to you to do what you think on this day, his birthday. So, hey, no, Nawahi o Kalani Pulu, right?